Would you mind giving these guys a brief overview of the history of catch wrestling leading to scientific wrestling?
So, catch is an amalgamation of several European styles of wrestling. In the northern part, so in England, there's a north and south. It's like the opposite of the United States. The southerners are kind of the country folk, and the sophisticated cosmopolitans are up north. It's the opposite. So the country folk are up north, which is up by England or Ireland. Right around the potato famine, which was around 1870, you had all this migration happening into the north of England. You had the Irish coming over because of the potato famine. They either went over across the channel to Wigan, which is like 200 miles, or they went to the United States because they were starving. Or you had the Flemish coming up from the Netherlands, and these were typically weavers. They did like weaving of tapestries and rugs, and they were immigrating. And then you had the local kind of country people in Lancashire. And all of these people kind of converged at the same time and brought their own special thing. So there was already this notion of Lancashire up and down fighting in the 1870s. And this was really brutal. It wasn't super technical. It's kind of like what you saw in Gangs of New York. If any of you saw that, where they're ripping ears and taking eyes. And they had different rules. You have to remember, everything back then, they couldn't swipe left and right. And they didn't have Xbox and all that shit. They were bored. And they had booze and betting. And they bet on everything. They bet if you could jump standing into a barrel. You know what I mean? Like a big barrel you see, those wooden barrels. They make bets on stuff like that. But one of the things they bet on a lot was fighting. And they'd fight dogs, they'd fight cocks, they'd fight humans. And so the Lancashire up and down fighting started. Now, you have to understand, typically in Europe, it was very frowned upon. In fact, it was illegal to wrestle on the ground. You were like a scumbag. You know how like you do leg locks in a IBJJF club? Like worse than like that. Like you would go to jail if you did any kind of ground wrestling. Everything was upper body wrestling, which is what Greco-Roman style, which is actually new. It was for the first Olympics right at the end of the 19th century. All upper body wrestling. Now that was okay, that was noble, you could throw the guy and all that, but you didn't do anything on the ground once somebody hit the ground. The Lancashire up and down fighting was for betting, and it was amongst the poor people of the northern part of England, and so they really started betting a lot. They had some fucked up rules. So one of the things they would do is they basically wear like golf shoes. They were like wooden clogs, but they were made of wood. They're wooden clogs and had spikes on them. And they just kicked the shit out of each other's shins. Like tons of people died from infections because they're walking in like cow patties and shit. They're wrestling out in the fields and stuff and then kicking each other, and they died of gangrene poisoning over a bet. I mean, this is how bored and how cheap life was back then. So you had the Lancashire kind of rough and tumble people. Then you had the Irish coming over with the collar and elbow, which was the style that was very popular amongst the founding fathers of the United States. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, these were all champions in collar and elbow style, which was originally an Irish style. And then you had the Weavers coming up, and they actually had a weird submission style from Belgium, where they had submissions, the ankle locks, the wrist locks, the chokes. All those met together in the north of England under this heavy betting culture. And the publicans, it's not like Democrats, Republicans. Publicans are people who run pubs, which is like fucking everywhere. If you go and take a train, like a subway in England, they have pubs at every fucking stop. It's like everywhere. Pubs are like the thing in England. So the publicans wanted a draw to bring people in to buy booze. So they started hosting these matches, and people would bet on it. And that was the first professional wrestling. Was in the 1870s, these early catch-as-catch-can matches. Now, that particular style got really hot up north in Wigan and Bolton. People always say Wigan is the home of catch wrestling. Technically, it's actually Bolton, which is the next door neighbor. But Wigan was hot at the end of catch its popularity, so that's what they remembered.
At this point, was it already a mixture of all these?
Yeah, so now you've kind of got an amalgamation of all those groups, and they came to like a general idea on rule set. Okay. Now, some of those people then, because of the potato famine, that style starts going over to Ireland, and some of the Irish come to the United States. They get sucked into the Civil War, and everybody's bored. It gets conscripted in the Civil War, so they start doing catch wrestling in the United States. So it kind of happens in both countries simultaneously and ends up having a little bit of its own flavor. Ironically, because it got so popular up in the north, the South, down in London, the Sophisticates decided to make their own style of catch-as-catch-can wrestling, and it was lighter on submissions. And so that is the original catch-as-catch-can that you find entered into the 1904 Olympics. So it gets over to the United States. So it's in Wigan, and that's cool, and the north of, it hits the whole country. It's north-south, like whatever, it takes off. It's a very popular style. But in the United States, you know, you have to understand, like, there was no TV, there was no radio. The main forms of entertainment back then were in the cities, vaudeville, and in the country, carnivals. And so, like, a lot of the wrestlers would go around traveling with these carnivals and give exhibitions or challenge people, and it still had a very heavy betting culture. Eventually, it blew up like crazy. In around what's called the golden age of catch wrestling, around the turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th century, it got crazy. Like, it blew up. Still to this day, I think maybe the largest gate for a pure grappling event was in Chicago, which was Gotch versus Hackenschmidt, which was 30,000 people in live attendance, which is fucking unbelievable. That was in Chicago, okay, for grappling and for catch wrestling. Now, today with the internet, you can get like 500,000 views on shit, and it's not a big deal. But back then, that was like unbelievable. People would have to travel and stuff. They had that much heat.